Well, we are off and running with training camp. Pitt started yesterday in the South Side. They had the first practice, and we've been talking about this all week. We've been talking about this dating back to last week, getting ready for the start of training camp. I mean, somebody asked the other day, hey, when does camp start? It's like, we've been talking about this for a week. We've been saying camp is about to start, and it finally got started yesterday. I think we broke down the team from every angle we possibly could heading into the start of training camp. And now coming out of the first day of camp, we've got all kinds of things to talk about here on the Morning Pitt. We talked about it last night on the live Panther-Lair show. It's going to be all we talk about. I mean, Pitt football is kind of always all we talk about. We get a lot of Pitt basketball in there as well. I mean, we talked about Pitt football for the last 8 months. Now it's finally happening. Training camp is underway, and we've got some real things to discuss. So what did we see at camp yesterday? What stood out? What did we learn from the players and coaches at Media Day? A lot. And I think there were some common themes, some things that came up quite a bit. And we're going to talk about it all here on the Thursday edition of the Morning Pitt. Let's dive into it. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Thursday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Pitt football, basketball, recruiting, transfer portal, all the Pitt stuff you could possibly hope for. We cover it all at Panther-Lair.com. Of course, we have message boards to talk with other Pitt fans. We had tons of content out of the first day of camp yesterday. Jim was down at practice. He had a full practice report. We got photos and things like that. And then, of course, from Media Day, yesterday afternoon, lots of interviews and videos and articles and all kinds of different things. And that's going to keep flowing, too. We haven't published all of it yet. We put up some of it last night. We'll put up more of it today. And we'll keep that content flowing pretty much throughout the month of August until the season starts with that game against Duquesne on August 30th. And then it'll just be rolling from there. So we got a lot of coverage, a lot of content coming from yesterday's Media Day, and that's all at Panther-Lair.com, and people were talking about it on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. Quick note on the basketball side, we'll have coverage tonight from the Peterson Event Center. We'll get a chance to talk to Jeff Capel, watch a little bit of Pitt basketball practice, so look for that on Panther-Lair.com as well. But in the meantime, let's talk Pitt football, let's talk Media Day, and let's also mention you should like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com so you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. We have Pitt video content all the time as it is year-round, and we'll have even more now that training camp has started. Video from practice, interviews, all those kinds of things. And, of course, once the season starts, we'll have press conferences, post-game shows, and all of that. All right, let's jump into it. Media Day yesterday. The first thing that I think we should probably talk about is the news that came out, the personnel news. You know, we spent a lot of time this offseason talking about Pitt's depth situation at running back. I feel like multiple times in the mailbag throughout the offseason, we would get questions about whether or not Pitt was going to take a transfer running back. The answer was always no. They were comfortable with what they had. They were comfortable with Desmond Reed, Derek Davis, Juelz Goff, and then the three incoming freshmen, Jakarian Turner, who enrolled in enrolled in January, and then Sinquan Smith and Jalen Brown, who were set to enroll in June. They were going to roll with those six. They would have Desmond Reed leading the charge, and everybody else sort of falling in behind. Probably need a contribution from a freshman, but it's okay. They felt good about that group. Well, the problem is, most of those guys won't be available this year. Well, half of that group won't be available this year. It literally is like if they were all sitting in a line, look to your left, look to your right, one of the people you just looked at won't be here to play this season. Half of those six running backs are out for the 2025 season. Redshirt senior Derek Davis suffered a pretty bad knee injury in the regular season finale at Boston College last year. He missed all of spring camp. His return was uncertain as far as the timeline on the return. And then Pat Narduzzi said yesterday that Davis would maybe make it back by November, so they're going to put him on a medical scholarship so he can stay on scholarship but not count against the scholarship limit, although that shouldn't be an issue, but whatever. He's going to move into, Pat Narduzzi said, a coaching role. He's going to help out in that regard, but he's not going to be playing. So that's one running back off the board. And a veteran running back, too. Although he doesn't have a ton of experience, he was still, second among the running backs in rushing attempts last year. So there's a little something to be said for it. And then not one, but two of the incoming freshmen not available to play this season. Saquon Smith from Georgia, fast guy, explosive guy, a late add to the 2025 recruiting class, got hurt in his last game, the last game of his senior career, the last game of his high school career, and he won't be available this season. And then Jaylen Brown from Orlando, Florida, excuse me. I think, did I get those two mixed up? Let me just double check on that. I get these two guys because they both committed late in the process. Yeah, Brown's from Orlando, Florida. Another late add to the recruiting class. He had 1,000 yards for Cardinal Newman last year. And he arrived at Pitt having had surgery for a PCL injury. And that's going to require recovery and rehab. There was ligament damage. And he's going to miss the 2025 season. So now your group of 6, which I think the general consensus, at least among those of us on the outside, is that depth was thin, even though there were 6 running backs on the roster. That group is now trimmed to 3: Desmond Reed, Juelz Goff, Jakarian Turner. And so you've got Desmond Reed, an All-American, all-purpose player. You've got Juelz Goff, who played in 3 games last year, and Jakarian Turner, who enrolled in college in January. Not an ideal situation. And now, after deciding not to take a transfer running back throughout December and even after spring camp, Pitt found itself scrambling for a transfer running back, and they found one, of all places, because where else do you look for skill position players? Western Carolina. Jalen Williams, a senior running back transferring in from Western Carolina. He spent a year at Toledo where he was like a wide receiver defensive back. Went to Western Carolina, played in 16 games over the last 3 seasons, put up about 600 total yards, scored, decent 12 touchdowns or something like that. Had 10 touchdowns last season on 34 carries. He's listed at 5'10", 210. So he's a bigger back. Fills a bit of that big back role that they were hoping Derek Davis could fill. And in not Derek Davis, they were hoping Jaylen Brown could fill. But now they're going to go with Jalen Williams. Lose a Jalen, add a Jalen. It's what they'll have to do. I mean, it's what they needed to do to fill out the depth. Now, I mean, ideally, the best case scenario is Desmond Reed and Juelz Goff stay healthy, Jakarian Turner fills in as the number 3 back, and you're all set to go. But you can't rely on that because that's relying on perfect health. That's relying on the highly unlikely scenario that all your running backs make it through the whole season without missing any time. And that's just not likely. We talked about it yesterday. We talk about it all the time with running backs. Running backs get hurt. It's a physical position. Guys get banged up. It's natural. Doesn't mean guys are fragile or injury prone or things like that. It means they play the most injury prone position. They themselves are not injury prone, but their position is because of the amount of contact they take. And in some cases initiate. And so you can't rely on that best case scenario happening. They needed to add some depth, and they found it in Jalen Williams as a transfer from Western Carolina. I don't know if he moves the needle a ton for Pitt's running game this year. I think it still is going to come down to Desmond Reed. Pat Narduzzi was very, offered a lot of praise for Jalen Williams. And so, we'll see what he's able to do. There's not a lot in his career, track record or his resume, but 10 touchdowns on 34 carries is pretty good. So we'll see what he's able to do. But if he's filling in behind Des Reed and Juelz Goff and splitting the number 3 work with Jakarian Turner, that's not too bad. I think that's a good use of a scholarship, and I think he will be on scholarship when, for his year at Pitt. I presume it'll just be this 1 year. So that was the big personnel news. That was the big movement, on the roster as far as guys not being available this year. Pat Narduzzi giving up all kinds of information about injuries. He always says he'll tell us when a guy is out for the full season, and that's the case with Saquon Smith, Jaylen Brown, and Derek Davis. We hope for healthy, effective recovery, certainly for Smith and Brown, and hopefully Davis is able to find his next step in life. Like Pat Narduzzi said, he's going to be helping out coaching-wise, so he can still be around and be part of the program. Moving back from the more specific things like injuries and personnel moves, there were a few other things that stood out. There were actually 2 things that really jumped out to me yesterday at Media Day. 2 things that really caught my attention because I heard them a lot. And the way they do it at Media Day, the setup is we had a press conference with Pat Narduzzi in the main press conference room and, all that stuff at the podium and everything like that. And then we move into another room with a bunch of tables. And in that room, we'll get all the defensive coaches. And for about a half hour, they're all sitting at tables. You can move around, talk to whoever you want, ask them whatever you want, and get as many interviews as you can. Half hour passes, those guys filter out. A bunch of defensive players, mostly starters and key contributors, come in, sit at the tables. You move around, you ask them all the questions, blah, blah, blah. Offensive coaches, half hour. Offensive players, half hour. And so you get to talk to a lot of guys. And if you move around, if you do it right, you keep moving. And sometimes you get caught up in conversation and only end up talking to one or two coaches. You don't get to talk to the whole staff because you kind of get in deep with some of these guys, and it's fun to have those conversations. But you can talk to quite a few guys, players and coaches, and get a real sense of some different topics and themes. And we ask them a lot of questions, sometimes ask them a lot of the same questions, player to player, coach to coach, or whatever it may be. But a couple themes, two themes in particular, came up a bunch of times in my conversation, particularly with the players, but also the coaches as well. And they weren't necessarily... It wasn't like I asked about these themes specifically. I asked about some other themes, and the players came out with a few things. And one was the idea of finishing. This came up more times than I could tell you. And you'll probably see it. You'll see some of the quotes because we'll publish some of these things because we did ask a few guys about last season, and how they went from 7-0 to 7-6 and kind of what changed and just what that experience was, what they took away from it, their perspective on starting 7-0 and then losing 6 games in a row. And one of the things a bunch of guys talked about, players and coaches, was finishing. They just didn't finish well enough. They had games in reach, and I think they're thinking about Virginia, they're thinking about Boston College, they're thinking about Clemson, they're thinking about Toledo. Those games we've talked about. We talked about a lot that, SMU, Louisville, they got beat up, they got blown out in those games. What are you going to do about that? Tough teams, really good teams on the road. You'd like to compete better than you did, but you got your heads beat in. But the other ones, Virginia, Clemson, Boston College, Toledo, which ultimately those 4 games, even if you just take the 3 regular season games, it's the difference between 7-5 and 10-3 or 10-2, right? And those games, they were close, but they just weren't able to finish. And I'll give Pitt's players and I think most of the coaches credit on this, certainly the players. I don't know if a single one of them mentioned injuries. And this was something I wondered about. How much was this program? How much were the people in this program going to talk about injuries? Well, Branson Taylor got hurt, and that just changed everything up. Or Eli Holstein got hurt, and it's hard when you don't have your starting quarterback. And I think Pat Narduzzi made a mention of injuries. And maybe I know Jeremy Darveau, the offensive line coach, when I was talking to him specifically about the fallout of Branson Taylor's injury. So he talked about it there. And we'll come back to something else that Darveau talked about because it's the other big theme that I kept hearing yesterday. But almost to a man, when we asked the players about their perspective on last season and the collapse and the 6-game losing streak, they didn't default to talking about injuries. They didn't default to making those excuses and rationalizations. They talked about their own failures and inabilities to finish the games. And it was interesting because I forgot which player I was talking to. It was like the 3rd or 4th guy that had brought this up. And I said, it's funny. I keep hearing this about finishing games, like not finishing, whether it's finishing drives, finishing sacks, finishing, Jimmy Scott said, well, it's like the difference between me having 6 sacks and 10 sacks. We need to be able to finish. And I thought, and I forget which player I said it to. I was like, man, I keep hearing this. I keep hearing about finishing. Like, what? Has this been one of the big themes for the coaches? And I think it was like Jake Overman might have said, no, actually, this is something the players, have been talking about. I mean, the coaches always talk about finishing. That's always important. But us, the players, are the ones who have really kind of been pushing this amongst ourselves, that, like, we need to finish better. And I just think that's interesting. And, like, it's probably one of those things you can't really, you know it after the fact, right? Like you're not going to know if a team is good at finishing until they actually get in games and you find out if they finish or not, right? If they fall short, if they lose games in the 4th quarter, then obviously they weren't good at finishing. And, if they win games in the 4th quarter or hold on and, hold teams off or whatever, like, then they were. It'll be something that's proven out when the games are actually played. But it's interesting to hear so many guys talking about that, and you wonder how it sort of trickles down to their perspective and their approach to practice, to film study, to the classroom, to meeting with the coaches, to game planning, all the different things. You wonder how it filters down, if it affects their mindset when they go about preparing. If they have an understanding of like, look, we can be a pretty decent team. We were good for the first half of the season, not for the second half of the season. We had games in the second half of the season where we were pretty good for the first half of the first 3 quarters, but we just weren't able to finish. We didn't finish drives. We didn't finish games. We didn't finish the season. Like, it'll be interesting to see if they're better at that this year, and it'll be interesting to see if their focus on it now turns into more success doing it in 2025. So that was one big theme that I heard about. The other theme that came up a bunch of times, and this was from all players and some of the coaches, whether it was offense or defense, is depth. And I know we just spent a lot of time starting this video talking about the running back depth and how it's really thin, and then they just lost 3 more guys. It was already thin to begin with, and then they lost 3 more. But outside of running back, there seems to be a lot of confidence in the depth this team has. And not just the depth that it has, but how that depth will help them in the season. Because one of the things that they all sort of generally acknowledged, either explicitly or implicitly, is that they just didn't have enough depth at key positions. But I mean, when I'm talking to like Rashad Battle and Tamon Lynham, they're talking about not just the corners, not just the secondary, but the defense as a whole is so much deeper than it was a year ago. They seem to have a lot more confidence in the depth this year than they did last year. And I hear that from the offensive players as well. And like I mentioned, Jeremy Darvo, when I'm sitting down talking with the offensive line coach, and, I asked him, the Branson Taylor injury caused chaos across the line. If I had asked you in August last year, would you have anticipated that? Did you get a sense that you were one injury away from things really blowing up? And he said, well, we knew that there was at least one position, that being tackle, that we really didn't want to lose anybody. But I don't know if we really realized how tough it would be if we lost one of those guys. And so they found out, obviously. And I said, well, by contrast, how do you feel about the depth now? And he said, much better, which I would expect them to say. I wouldn't expect them to sit at media day and say, well, it's not any better than it was a year ago. I would expect him to be a little bit more optimistic and feel a little bit better about it. But I think, this is something we've talked about so much this offseason, is this topic of depth, of being able to withstand an injury or a situation that arises, which they couldn't last year, and it went a long way toward the struggles that they experienced in the final 6 games. And so there seems to be a prevailing thought and sentiment throughout this team, players and coaches, that they are deeper than they were a year ago, and that will help them win games this year, because if they run into an injury situation or whatever it might be that causes them to go into the depth, they'll have the horses to get out there and play. They'll have the guys ready in reserve roles who can walk on the field and, ideally play at a high level and have some success. So those were the things that really, everybody talked, these guys talked about a lot. We asked them a lot of questions, talked about a lot of different topics, but those were the ones that really stood out to me. The idea of finishing and the idea of depth. And those might end up being the 2 main elements for this team. If they're able to win games this year, if they're able to have more success than they did a year ago, it very well might be a result of finishing better and having better depth. But we'll see. That's what they were all talking about at Media Day yesterday, and it all caught my eye. Of course, there was a lot that caught my eye and caught my ear, and you can get as much of it as you want at Panther-Lair.com. So head over to the website, Panther-Lair.com, the Pitt site on the 24/7 Sports Network, so you get all of the Pitt football coverage, Pitt basketball coverage, Pitt recruiting, transfer portal, everything coverage, all at Panther-Lair.com. and message boards to talk about what's going on. Everything from training camp, we'll be posting all the coverage. You can join in the conversation on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. While you're here, make sure you like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'll have the mailbag tomorrow, so get your questions in on the message board at Panther-Lair.com. So thanks for watching the video today. Hope you've had a great week so far. Enjoy your Thursday. It's almost Friday, folks. You know what that means. Favorite day of the week, mailbag edition of the Morning Pit, all that stuff. So like this video and subscribe. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Have a great Thursday. We'll catch up with you tomorrow morning for the Morning Pit mailbag edition right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.